Hey everybody, it's Miss Elizabeth, and I'm here for another Bedtime Stories video, reading Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH, which is by Robert C. O'Brien, illustrated by Zena Bernstein, and is published by Athenaeum Books for Young Readers, which is an imprint of Simon & Schuster children's books. So, we are making a good way through here. We're on, I believe, page 89, it looks like. So, what is that, the 13th chapter, maybe? Let us count. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, indeed. We are ready for chapter 13. So, if you remember where we left off yesterday, Mrs. Frisby is in the library of where the rats live, and she was talking with a young rat named Isabella, and she was kind of talking about what the plan is, what the rats are, planning as far as moving and everything, and we learned about a rat that did not agree with the plan, whose name was Jenner, and had left, and so Mrs. Frisby is a little bit interested about that. And right before we left off, Nicodemus, Justin, Mr. Ages, and a new rat have entered. So we're going to start with that 13th chapter, which is called A Powder for Dragon. The strange rat was named Arthur. He was stocky, square, and muscular, with bright, hard eyes. He looked deficient. "You might call him our chief engineer," said Nicodemus to Mrs. Frisby, "as indeed you might call Justin the captain of the guard, if we had any such titles, but we don't. Mr. Ages thought Arthur should come along, though he didn't say why, so we still don't know what your problem is." Isabella was gone. She had dropped her papers on the floor again when the others had entered, and Justin, to her intense confusion and visible delight, had helped her pick them up. "Hello, Izzy," he had said. "How's the reading coming?" "It's fine," she said. I finished the 3rd reader last week. Now I'm on the 4th. "The 4th reader already? You're getting quite grown up." At that she had almost dropped the papers a 3rd time and made a dash for the door. It did not matter, Mrs. Frisby noticed, if Justin called her Izzy, just so he called her something. Nicodemus closed the door behind her, then sat down on one of the benches facing Mrs. Frisby. The others sat down too, Mr. Ages stretching his splinted leg in front of him. Nicodemus took the reading glass from his satchel, opened it, and through it gravely examined Mrs. Frisby's face. "You will forgive the glass and the scrutiny," he said. "When I lost my left eye, I also damaged the right one. I can see little close up without the glass. Indeed, not very much even with it." At length he folded the glass and put it on the table. "Now," he said, "what is it we can do to help you?" So, Mrs. Frisby recounted once more the events that had led to her coming there, and at the end repeated what the owl had advised her to say: "Move the house into the lee of the stone." She added, "I don't understand just what he meant by that. Jeremy, the crow, says it means the side where there's no wind, but what good would that do?" "I think I know what he meant," said Nicodemus. "In a broad sense, lee means the sheltered side. A bird flying over Mrs. Fitzgibbon's garden would notice something most of us would miss." He reached into his satchel and took out a sheet of paper and a pencil. He opened the reading glass again, and as he talked, he drew a sketch. "When a farmer plows a field with a big rock in it, he plows around the rock, close on each side, but leaving a triangle of unplowed land on each end. Mrs. Frisby's house is beside the rock and will get plowed up and probably crushed, as the owl said. But if we can move it a few feet so that it lies buried behind the rock, in the lee, then she and her child can stay in it as long as they need to. From the air, the way the owl sees it, the garden would look like this." He inspected the sketch through the reading glass and then placed it on the table. Mrs. Frisby climbed up on the bench and looked at it. It was a rough map, showing the garden, the big stone near the middle, and the way the furrows made by the plow would curve around it, rather like waves around a boat. "Show me where your house is buried," said Nicodemus. Mrs. Frisby pointed to the spot on the sketch. I know where that cinder block is, said the rat named Arthur. In fact, I thought about bringing it in, but I decided it was too long a haul. They had it tied on top of the harrow for weight, and it fell off just as they were finishing the garden. Can you move it, asked Nicodemus, pointing at the sketch, to this spot right here and bury it again? Yes, said Arthur, that shouldn't be hard. Mrs. Frisby was delighted. Looking at the map, it all became clear, and she could see what a beautifully simple idea it was. When Mr. Fitzgibbon plowed, he would go right past their house. They would not have to move until Timothy was well and until the weather was truly warm. She remembered again what her husband had said, how easy to unlock a door when you have the key. She had found the key, or rather, the owl had found it. Nicodemus asked Arthur, How long will it take? Depends. With a party of 10, a couple of hours. With 20, maybe an hour. We can spare 20, but it's still too long. He looked worried. So did Arthur. Yes, he said. We'll have to work at night, but even so, there's just no cover at all. It's wide open. We'll have to take care of Dragon, said Justin. Yes, said Mr. Ages, and with this leg I can't do it. I'd never make it to the bowl, much less get back again. Mrs. Frisby, looking at their baffled faces, felt her delight subsiding. Obviously something was wrong. I don't understand, she said. I know about Dragon, of course, but... At night, said Justin, Dragon prowls the farmyard like a tiger, and you don't see him until he's on top of you. Then you can't move my house after all. Well, Justin said ordinarily, he turned to Nicodemus. Should I explain it to her? Yes, said Nicodemus. Ordinarily, said Justin, when we have a long project to do at night, sometimes even by day, we make sure Dragon won't bother us. We put sleeping powder in his food. Mr. Ages makes it. It doesn't do the cat any harm, but he stays extremely drowsy for the next 8 hours or so. We station a sentry to watch him, and we're free to work. You did it yesterday, cried Mrs. Frisby, remembering the figures toiling the wire through the grass, remembering how strangely disinterested Dragon had seemed when he saw her. I saw the cat sleeping in the yard. Yes, said Justin, but today Mr. Ages has a broken leg. That he can't make the powder? It isn't that. It isn't that, said Mr. Ages. I've plenty of the powder. The trouble is, said Justin, it's Mr. Ages who puts it in Dragon's dinner bowl inside the farm kitchen. With his leg broken, he can't move fast enough. But why Mr. Ages? Said Mrs. Frisby. Can't someone else do it? I'd be glad to do it myself, said Justin, but I'm too big. You see, Nicodemus explained, Mrs. Fitzgibbon feeds the cat in the morning and in the evening, and his bowl is always kept in the same place, next to a cabinet in one corner of the kitchen. There's a very shallow space between the floor and the bottom of the cabinet. A few years ago, when we conceived the idea of putting Dragon to sleep, we cut a hole in the floor just behind the cabinet. If we put it anywhere else, they'd see it. To reach the bowl, Mr. Ages crawls under the cabinet. When he gets to the edge, he makes a quick dash to the bowl, drops in the powder, and dashes back out of sight. But with a broken leg, he can't dash. We might try leaving some bait outside the house, said Justin. That worked once. Once out of a dozen tries, said Nicodemus. It isn't dependable, and we don't have much time. To be safe, we ought to move that block tonight. If we had some cat food, said Justin, thinking aloud, he might eat that, even on the porch, because he knows it's his. Maybe tonight I could go in through the attic and down to the kitchen. No use, said Mr. Ages. They keep it in a metal cabinet up on the wall. You couldn't get it without a crew, and that would make too much noise. Anyway, said Nicodemus, it would put off moving the block until tomorrow night. Then, Justin said, I guess what we do is stake out scouts wherever we can, try to keep track of Dragon and hope for the best. Some nights he doesn't go near the garden at all. We might be lucky. Or we might not, said Arthur. I don't like it. We can't dig that block out without some noise, you know. Mrs. Frisby interrupted quietly. There's another way, she said. If Mr. Ages can get into the kitchen, so can I. If you'll give me the powder and show me the way, I will try to put it in a Dragon's bowl. Justin said quickly, "No, it's no job for a lady." "You forget," Mrs. Frisby said. "I'm Timothy's mother. If you and Arthur and others in your group can take risks to save him, surely I can too. And consider this. I don't want any of you to be hurt, maybe even killed by Dragon. But even more, I don't want the attempt to fail. Perhaps the worst that will happen to you, with luck, is that you will have to scatter and run and leave my house unmoved. But then what will happen to us? Timothy, at least, will die. So if there is no one else to put the cat to sleep, I must do it." Nicodemus considered and then spoke. "She's right, of course. If she chooses to take the risk, we can't deny her the right." To Mrs. Frisby he added, "But you should know that the danger is great. It was in that same kitchen yesterday, running from Dragon's Bowl, that Mr. Aegis got his leg broken. And it was in doing the same thing last year that your husband died." On to the next chapter, chapter 14, The Marketplace. Mrs. Frisby's head was buried in her arms. "I never knew," she said. "All I knew was that he didn't come back. But I never knew what happened. I didn't even know he knew you. Why didn't he ever tell me?" Justin touched her shoulder gently. "It's hard for you to learn it this way, so suddenly," he said. "We thought about telling you when it happened, but we decided we shouldn't. It wouldn't have done any good." "You ask why Jonathan never told you about us," Nicodemus added. "He had a reason, a good one. Still, he worried about it a lot, and he might have told you in the end, but then it was too late." "What was the reason?" Mrs. Frisby raised her face. There were tears on her cheeks, but she had stopped crying. "To answer that, I would have to tell you quite a long story, the whole story about us, and Nim, and Jonathan, and how we came here. He came with us, you see. I don't mind doing that, but I don't know if there's time now." "I think there is," said Justin, "if Mr. Aegis and I go to get the powder while you're telling it." "With this leg," said Mr. Aegis glumly, "that will take long enough to tell it twice." "I had forgotten," said Justin contritely. "Would it be better if I went alone?" "No," said Mr. Aegis. "There are so many different powders in my storeroom, you wouldn't know which to bring back. I'll go with you, but we'll go slowly." "And I," said Arthur, "will see about the equipment for tonight. We'll need shovels, crowbars, block and tackle, rollers." He left, still listing tools. Nicodemus said to Mrs. Frisby, "I think that we, too, should leave the library. There will be others coming in, like Isabella, to practice reading, and some to do research." "Research?" "We've got some new books on agriculture, farming, gardening, fertilizing, things like that, and we're studying them. It's part of the plan." "I don't know what the plan is." "No," agreed Nicodemus, "but when I've told you our story, you'll understand that too." He opened the door and led Mrs. Frisby down the corridor past several more doors, all closed. He stopped before one, which he opened. "My office," he said. "Please come in." The room she entered was smaller than the library, but much more comfortably, almost elegantly, furnished. There was a rug on the floor, the same pattern, she noticed, as the carpet in the hallway above, a light recessed in the ceiling, and another in the wall next to a table. There were bookshelves. On one shelf an electric clock hummed quietly to itself. A book lay open on the table, with a chair in front of it. Against the opposite wall stood a small sofa, neatly upholstered in cloth. But what attracted Mrs. Frisby's attention most was a box in one corner of the room, a box with dials and a small light shining on the front. From this box came the soft sound of music. She listened entranced. "You like music," said Nicodemus. "So do I." "That must be a radio." Again, something vaguely remembered from what Jonathan had once told her. Music. She had heard it only 2 or 3 times in her life, when the Fitzgibbons had left a window open and someone was playing inside, and never up close. It was a lovely sound. "Yes," said Nicodemus. "We didn't get it from music, of course, but to hear the news. Still, as long as it's here, why not use it?" He sat down, and so did Mrs. Frisby. "Now," he said, "I will tell you about Nim." You'll be interested, I think, because your husband was part of it, and when I'm finished, I think you will see why he felt he could not tell you for himself." "The story begins," Nicodemus continued, "not at NIMH, but at a marketplace on the edge of a big city. It was called the Farmer's Market, a great square of a place with a roof over part of it, and no walls to speak of. There, early every morning, the farmers arrived from all over the surrounding countryside, with trucks full of tomatoes, corn, cabbages, potatoes, eggs, chickens, hams, food for the city. One part of it was reserved for the fishermen, who brought crabs and oysters and bass and flounders. It was a fine place, noisy and full of smells. We lived near this market, my father, my mother, my 9 sisters and brothers, and I, underground in a big pipe that had once been part of a storm sewer, but was no longer used. There were hundreds of other rats in the neighborhood. It was a rough life, but not so hard as you might think because of the market. Every evening at 5 o'clock, the farmers and the fishermen would close up their stalls, pack up their trucks, and go home. At night, hours later, the clean-up men would arrive with brooms and hoses. But in between, the market was ours. The food the farmers left behind, peas and beans that fell from the trucks, tomatoes and squashes, pieces of meat and fish trimmed as waste. They lay on the sidewalks and in the gutters. They filled great cans that were supposed to be covered, but seldom were. There were always 10 times more than we could eat, and so there was never any need for fighting over it. Fighting? Quite the contrary. The marketplace was a perfect place for playing, and so we did, the young rats at least, as soon as we had finished eating. There were empty boxes for hide-and-seek, there were walls to climb, tin cans to roll, a piece of twine to tie and swing on. There was even, in the middle of the square, a fountain to swim in when the weather was hot. Then, at the first clang of the clean-up men in the distance, one of the older rats would sound a warning, and everyone would pick up as much food as he could to carry home. All of us kept a reserve supply, because some days, Sundays and holidays, the market would be closed, and we were never quite sure when this would happen. When I went to the market, it was usually with 2 companions, my older brother Gerald and a friend of ours named Jenner. These were my 2 closest friends. We liked the same games, the same jokes, the same topics of conversation, even the same kinds of food. I particularly admired Jenner, who was extremely quick and intelligent. One evening in early fall, Jenner and I set out for the marketplace. It must have been September, for the leaves were just turning yellow and some children were throwing a football in a vacant lot. Gerald had to stay home that night. He had caught a cold, and since the air was chilly, my mother thought he should not go out. So Jenner and I went without him. I remember we promised to bring him back some of his favorite food, beef liver, if we could find any. We took our usual route to the market, not along the streets, but through the narrow walkways between the buildings, mostly commercial warehouses and garages that bordered the square. As we walked, we were joined by more rats. At that time of day, they converged on the marketplace from all directions. When we reached the square, I noticed that there was a white truck of an odd, square shape parked on the street bordering it, perhaps a block away. I say I noticed it. I did not pay any particular attention to it, for trucks were common enough in that part of town. But if I had, I would have noticed that printed on each side of it were 4 small letters, NIMH. I would not have known what they were, of course, for at that time neither I nor any of the other rats knew how to read. It was growing dark when we reached the market, but through the dusk we could see that there was an unusually large supply of food, a great mound of it, near the center of the square, away from the roofed-over portion. I suppose that should have served as a warning, but it didn't. I remember Jenner saying they must have had a really busy day, and we ran joyfully toward the pile along with several dozen other rats. Just as we reached the food, it happened. All around us, suddenly, there was shouting. Bright, blinding searchlights flashed on, aimed at us and at the mound of food, so that when we tried to run away from it, we could not see where we were going. Between and behind the lights, there were shadows moving swiftly, and as they came toward us, I could see that they were men. Men in white uniforms, carrying nets, round nets with long handles. "Look out!" cried Jenner. "They're trying to catch us!" He darted in one direction, I in another, and I lost sight of him. We all ran, straight toward the men with the nets. There was no other way to run. They had us encircled. The nets flailed down, scooped, flailed again. I suppose some rats made it through, slipping between the men and past the lights. I felt a swish. A net just missed me. I turned and ran back toward the mound, thinking I might hide myself in it. But then came another swish, and that time I felt the enveloping fibers fall over me. They entangled my legs, then my neck. I was lifted from the ground along with 3 other rats, and the net closed around us. Getting into some good stuff. Learning about what these rats of NIMH are and their story and where they came from. We are now on page 102. We've read 14 chapters, so I think we're just about halfway through. Let's see, little under halfway. We've got 233 pages, so we're getting there. I hope you guys are enjoying it. I know I am. Such a good story. So I will see you guys again tomorrow, and we will pick up with chapter 15, which is called In the Cage. So I'll see you then. All right. Bye.